Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to join you here for our latest event, the future of heat, and not the weather outside, though I'm sure that we all want to be outside. We also want to hear about heat, and we want to hear from experts who understand domestic energy efficiency, which is the issue described by Lord Deben, who's the chair of the Committee on Climate Change, as, and I quote, the most complicated and important infrastructure challenge for decarbonisation. So there we are. It doesn't get the coverage normally in politics that it deserves, largely because it's complicated and difficult. And when things are complicated and difficult in politics, people tend to glaze over. But thankfully, we have people who really understand and know about this here with us today. But yeah, the government's made a lot of big commitments on this, the 10-point plan, manifesto commitments, but there were big challenges with the Green Homes Grant, as I'm sure everybody understands. And I know that we'll be looking at and eagerly awaiting the heat and building strategy when it comes out. Ahead of that, we really want to examine all the issues and anticipate the next big policy announcements on where things are going and where they need to go. We're delighted to have worked with the Sustainable Energy Association and the National Energy Action on this event. And we're going to hear from their CEOs, Jade Lewis and Adam Scorer, as well. We'll also be hearing from Gillian Charlesworth, who's the Chief Executive of BRE Group, not far from me, in Hertfordshire, David Pinder, who's the Chair of the Green Construction Board, and Dr. Taj Oreshin, who is from UCL's Energy Institute. Alongside this, we'll welcome contributions from everybody. All of you, put your comments and chat in the and questions rather in the chat and Q&A boxes. Put them in as people are talking. Probably now you put them in if you think anything I'm saying is wrong or rubbish, or you think you want to challenge any of it or ask any of our speakers any questions. So do feed through, or I will just be asking the questions myself, which is less interesting and less good than you asking them. I want to let you know before we kick off, this is the first of a series of quickfire events between now and the summer recess, building some momentum. Next week, we're going to cover hydropower with Drax, and then we're into a series of COP, looking at China, vulnerable countries, fossil fuel economies, and the United States. We're going to cover consumer confidence in green tariffs, and we'll look in detail at the NATO summit that comes up. So please join us for all of that if you are so minded. But first, I'm going to hand over to Jade Lewis, who's the CEO of SEA, the Sustainable Energy Association. Jade, over to you.
Thank you, Bim, and good morning, everyone. The SEA is a membership organisation made up of energy suppliers, manufacturers, installers, housing providers, and other organisations with expertise in energy and buildings. We're committed to achieving our vision to help create living and working spaces fit for future generations by ensuring that all buildings are energy efficient, net zero carbon, warm, and healthy. And I was asked to speak to you today to give my views on what overarching long-term policy is required from the government in anticipation of the eagerly awaited heat and building strategy. Our President, Lord Bess, was informed in a parliamentary debate last December that the government will publish a heat and building strategy in early 2021, and that will set out the immediate actions they will take for reducing emissions from buildings, including deploying energy efficiency measures and transitioning to low carbon heating. This ambitious programme of work would enable the mass transition of low carbon heat and set us on a path to meet our net zero 2050 emissions targets. And unfortunately, we are yet to see this key strategy be published. Firstly, I thought it would be helpful to set out the current direction of travel. The 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference is due to be held in Glasgow in November this year, and this offers a real opportunity for the UK to showcase leadership and ambition in tackling this global crisis. Meanwhile, climate emergencies are being declared across councils and combined authorities, with local strategies and targets being developed in regions across the UK. The Scottish Government has set out their own strategy, which signalled the key measures that will be prioritised for decarbonising buildings up to 2030. Including energy efficiency, heat pumps for properties on and off the gas grid, and heat networks. But we're now seeing a hold up of policy from the UK government until the heat and building strategy is published here. The government has committed funding for decarbonisation of public buildings via the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme, social housing via the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, and for fuel poor homes with the Warm Homes Discount, Energy Company Obligation and the Homes Upgrade Grant. Welcome reforms are also being made to operational performance metrics through the EPC Action Plan, which should improve the accuracy and consistency of EPCs and start the journey towards building ratings that genuinely reflect real energy performance. And also we're seeing an increased use of smart technologies via smart metering, connected homes, smart tariffs and electric vehicles. And it's vital that the low carbon heat fits seamlessly alongside these and can respond flexibly to pricing signals from the national grid, helping to balance supply of intermittent renewables with demand. So what needs to be provided via the heat and building strategy? Most importantly, we need a long-term framework that provides a strategic direction of travel and answers the key questions like what's happening to the gas grid, how will homes be heated off the gas grid, how are heat pumps going to be made more attractive to consumers, what role is there for decentralised renewable generation, where are the potential hydrogen clusters, and long-term joined-up policy is vital for providing confidence for the sector to invest in the necessary innovation, the capacity and the skills that will be required. And this should include key implementation milestones from now up to 2050 that answers questions around phase out dates of high carbon technologies. We'd like to see the government take a whole house multi-measure approach that joins up the different trades and minimises long-term running costs whilst avoiding unintended consequences around mould, damp, poor air quality and overheating. There'll be a key role for energy efficiency improvements regardless of heating technology use, so a fabric first approach must also be taken. Homeowners typically don't take action to improve energy performance of their properties, so we need drivers and incentives to stimulate action in the able to pay sector, like council tax or stamp duty linked to energy efficiency, reduced rates of VAT or consequential improvements. And the SEA summarised our recommendations in the Addressing the Able to Pay Sector report, which can be found on the recess section of our website. Consistency is required across the different tenures when setting minimum energy efficiency standards. The SEA has been campaigning for a number of years for all buildings to be brought up to a minimum EPC band C by 2035. And while we have MEES in place for the private rented sector, we now need to see similar drivers in the social housing and the owner-occupier sectors. Consistent application and crucially enforcement of energy efficiency standards would drive long-term market demand and remove uncertainty for consumers. The SEA recognises there's no single solution to decarbonising energy in buildings and no one size fits all. Regional differences affect the cost of heating our buildings, the carbon emissions produced and the level and depth of fuel poverty. And therefore a local strategy for decarbonisation is needed to address the different challenges faced across the UK. These need to reflect differences in housing stock, climatic conditions, local income levels, etc. And because local authorities are closer to the point of delivery, they have a greater understanding of their particular needs and can play a key role in engaging residents. The heat and building strategy should allow for a localised approach within a national framework. And this should include a clear commitment to support underfunded local authorities to implement the transition to net zero, manage area-based schemes and enforce minimum energy efficiency standards. There's also a need to be for a commitment to providing independent consumer advice through maybe a one-stop shop, and this will be crucial to helping homeowners through the transition. So finally, I'll leave you with my top 3 key asks of government. Firstly, and most importantly, ensure that long-term certainty is provided through the policy framework. Secondly, we need to shift away from short-term incentives like the Green Homes Grant towards long-term drivers like variable council tax and stamp duty linked to energy performance. And finally, ensure a whole house technology agnostic approach is taken that considers broader health and wellbeing aspects as well as operational carbon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jade. Thank you. Now we move on to Adam Sporer from National Energy Action. Adam.
Thank you, Bim. And there was so much that Jade said that I absolutely agree with. First of all, congratulations to Prasek for breaking their Zoom ceiling and going above the 100 limit. It's always good, and what a good topic to do it on. There are many more people with expertise on the impact on buildings on this call, so I just want to stick to 5 critical points. But before I do it, for any we're a fuel poverty, energy efficiency charity. The drive towards decarbonising heat in domestic buildings within the context of the push to net zero is the first real opportunity to eradicate fuel poverty and to bring in all the benefits individually and societally and systemically of everybody having access to a warm home. It is really it's an opportunity, it's not a gift. There's huge numbers of challenges, but we have to regard it in that way. So my first point is, and this is why I think the subtitle to this event was absolutely spot on. If we persist, as we often do, in saying within the drive to decarbonisation of heat, let's remember the fuel poor, let's not leave people behind, let's recognise what we can do, we will fail or we will succeed partially. Have to be able to see this as twin drivers, twin pillars of the same direction. We're tackling the same things at the same time. If we don't do it, because there are so many moving parts and so many, there will be competing priorities within the context of decarbonisation of heat, as always happens, either we lose the most vulnerable and the poor off the agenda, or our neglect of them acts as a drag anchor in terms of the speed in which we're proceeding. So that's the first point. The second point is, if there's one thing that we've learned from, well, one of the many things that we've learned, and we have to learn from the experience of COVID, is that when the state steps in on an issue which has dramatic individual health and societal benefits, it has the power and the resources to identify the most vulnerable and the worst cases, and to put in place mechanisms so they go to the front of the queue and we treat them first and we recognize the benefits. Especially true, obviously, in a situation where we're trying to persuade every household in the country to take those steps. So the state has a really key role in using public funding to identify and assist through grant funding, primarily different mechanisms, the most vulnerable first. The reason why that is so particularly important in the context that we're discussing now is that we know we have to make a market. We have to make a really dramatic market. Lots of lessons again from Green Homes grants, not least procurement and the administrator, which was obviously a huge problem. But also in the challenge of making a market that affects everybody, especially the able to pay. There was lots of enthusiasm for the grant. We know there's slightly less enthusiasm for households, consumers, to invest in large sums of money ahead of perceived need. And so we know there's a challenge there, and that we know making the market that we want, which will be competitive and dynamic and lots of offers and lots of things that people can take advantage of in their particular circumstances, is going to be challenging. We have the opportunity, by recognizing the vulnerable first and what the state can do, to make not the market that we need, but the market that we're able to create at the beginning, focusing in on how you support people for whom investing ahead of need and rates of return is a foreign language, but making markets, getting local partnerships, establishing supply chains, being able to control that supply chain challenge so that you are able to deliver on a place-based basis. So the market that we need in order to drive towards a decarbonised wholly domestic heat market is not the one that's available to us at the moment, but we can make the market if we start with state funding and we look at the people in most needs and we learn the lesson from Green Homes grants, which is that LAD has been the success of it, and it needs to work with, and I hope that we get to hugs and take advantage of that local place-based opportunities. And Jade was absolutely right. We know there are areas where the incidence of fuel poverty is high, where the types of property that need attention are dominant, where there's no local authority capability or local consortium capability to drive it. So one of the parts of making effective markets for the long term is supporting and capacity building those local authorities and local partnerships so they can take the first steps. They can have those supply chain arrangements, they can have contracts with deliveries, they can talk to their local energy hubs, and they can start learning again how to deliver these sorts of things. So that's a critically important part. The fourth part that I want to make, and it's in the press today because of the outcome of the BEIS Select Committee, is there will be a need to ensure that the incentives of electrifying heat through heat pumps are more attractive. And that's going to force us, we have to, look at the way in which we levy policy costs on householders. if we go for a direct transition from electricity to gas, you'll hurt the most vulnerable. So we shouldn't do that. So we need to be agile and think from the beginning of what a fair and progressive way of understanding how we incentivize the cost base for heat pumps is there, and we need to do it. That will, without action, impact the fuel poor. It always does, and it always will. Let's not try and find rebates and compensatory mechanisms. Let's exempt them from the beginning. Let's take the decision, but you can do that without having to concern yourself with adding different layers of support and rebate so you undo the damage that you already do. Let's hardwire it in the beginning. And the last thing for me is we've got some predefined strategies. You know, we all get a bit of strategy fatigue. They're on the shelves and they don't really come off, but it's predefined strategies. We've had trouble with the delivery mechanism, although we have lessons across the whole of the UK, which we can learn from, and some good examples in local and regional areas. But in order for the future of heat to make a difference to the interests, the needs of fuel poor households, simple. We just need the money to enable those delivery mechanisms to do. So everything is looking good, but the last piece, and it's always the last piece, is persuading HMT, the Treasury, that not for a short-term economic stimulus, but for a long-term economic stimulus that decarbonises homes and improves the lives of the fuel poor is obviously, as it always is, the big missing piece of the jigsaw. Thanks.
Thank you. And yes, persuading HMT. We will come to this, I'm sure, in the questions. Next is Gillian Charlesworth, the CEO of BRE. Gillian.
Yes, thank you very much, Bim. I think probably Jade and Adam between them have really summarised the key points. I'm not going to say everything I would have said because I want to give plenty of time for debate, but I do pick up very much on the points that they're making about, sadly, as always, money and legislation, legislative drivers. In my conversations with the industry, it's clear to me that we have not got all the conditions in place to make the target that we've set. I think that's fairly obvious, but it is a question, I think, of funding, and I'll come to some specifics in a moment, and also a massive shift in mindset. The sense of urgency is growing, but it's not where it needs to be, not remotely. And I think that, you know, if I look around the group we see here, our generation is failing the next generation. Recently, BRE has we have a graduate training program. We had 900 applicants this year for 5 places. That generation is desperate to make a difference, and we need to make sure that we're making the progress to enable them to pick up the baton in a much better state. So what specifically are we saying? I would agree with everything Jade said. I think she rattled through an incredible number of measures that we can see coming together. But I do think that I would focus on that one point, that there doesn't appear at the moment to be an organising mind to put together a plan which actually makes sure that every single piece of funding that is applied to this question is well spent. I think we would all agree that there's a lot of opportunity for wasted effort and funding. One of the things that BRE does is the English Housing Survey, the stock modelling aspect of that, very focused on finding out on behalf of local authorities, where are those targeted interventions going to make the most difference to Adam's agenda of reducing fuel poverty? That does cost money, but it enables better targeting of solutions. I would, if we're looking at retrofit, which of course is the biggest and most complex part of this, again, picking up on what Adam's saying, there's an opportunity here, 500,000 jobs minimum. There's a real need for those people to be properly skilled. We've seen a lot of very shoddy workmanship. Again, wasted money, wasted effort, wasted funds. People are left in a worse condition than they started. So funding for for retrofit skills is needed, and that will ensure that every penny, again, is better spent. Finally, standards. BRE, we're a standards-based body. We do a lot of testing of pieces of kit, construction materials, buildings, and certifying to those standards. We think that the standards that are being set are somewhat tentative. The Future Home Standard is a good start, but we shouldn't see it as being the solution. It needs to evolve. It needs to become much more ambitious. And I'll just end by saying that I think there are lots of wins here. And I think the commercial real estate market is beginning to show that it recognises the economic opportunity of the agenda. Will be driven by the pandemic, undoubtedly, to do more, differently, better. How are we going to make that happen in the domestic homes market? There's a whole range of measures being discussed here, but the standard is crucial. Let's be more.
I'm coming off mute now. Okay.
We need to make sure that we're creating a sense of urgency, putting in place the right conditions to achieve more quicker. And that involves more government intervention in terms of legislative drivers and funding. I think there's no getting away from those 2 points. The industry itself will succeed to a certain extent, but it can't do it on its own. So my plea is for those 2 things. Let's recognise the level of crisis that we've got here and accelerate the effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gillian. And David, who gave us a little, intro to what he was going to say. David, I'm sure now has found the mute button. David, over to you. David Pinder, who's the chair of the Green Construction Board.
Thanks, Bim, and apologies, Gillian. I hovered over the mute button as I was releasing that, so apologies for speaking over you. Yes, so very pleased to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I'm chair of the Green Construction Board. When I'm not chairing the Green Construction Board, I'm chair of Mixergy, which is a scale-up company spun out of Oxford University, which focuses on delivering energy-efficient solutions for hot water in the home. And until the end of last year, I was also CEO of Baxi Heating, which is one of the largest manufacturers of boilers, cylinders and other heating systems in the UK, and now heat pumps. Just a quick word on the GCB. These days, it's the net zero workstream of the Construction Leadership Council, and we work across government with all departments of BEIS, also with DEFRA and MHCLG, and with industry to deliver a sustainable built environment. And we give expert advice on policy and also stimulate action within the industry. And we've got a program called Construct Zero, which is attempting to do that at the moment by bringing together best practice in the industry to deliver net zero. We work, many areas of focus across different sectors of the built environment, but probably the most relevant is the work that we've been doing on buildings. So we delivered a report a couple of years ago looking at how to deliver the clean growth mission and how to reduce energy demand in buildings by 50%, both new build and retrofit. And that's available on the CLC website. But what I really wanted to focus on is the retrofit strategy, and this builds on many of the strands that I've already heard from Jade and Gillian and Adam, and that is that we need to have a concerted effort to address this most difficult and challenging sector within the built environment, which is the existing homes that we already have, or 27 million plus of them. So why do we need a national retrofit strategy, which is what I want to talk about? So, I mean, homes, existing homes are responsible for 20% of the carbon emissions, 35% of energy demand in the country. But the policy that we've seen so far to tackle that has been far from successful. So whether that's the Green Homes Grant back in the day, or the Green Deal back in the day, we really haven't been successful in this area. And I think what we need to think about is where we've gone wrong and what we do differently. The most important thing, I think, Jade, you said it already, is that we need a long-term policy framework. We need a long-term strategy rather than these short-term interventions. And we need that to increase and improve confidence, both in the industry, but also in homeowners. So we need some really clear signposting. Now we see that in the automotive sector around diesel and hybrid cars, not being allowed to be sold from 2030, 2035. And that really clear signalling helps industry to scale up and invest to make sure that it's ready for those points in time. We've seen it to some extent with the Future Home Standard on new build, but we've not really seen anything signalling or giving a clear line of sight to industry or homeowners in the existing homes sector. So we need to address that. And we need to start to restore confidence. But we also need to act now. I mean, the problem is very real. We expect by 2050 more than 80% of homes will be those that we have with us today. By 2035, that percentage will be even higher. If we're going to eliminate 78% of emissions by 2035, we better make a start. So we need action today, and we're recommending in the National Retrofit Strategy that we invest at least 5 billion in this Parliament in order to kickstart the programme. And that brings with it many benefits. I mean, it will generate, we estimate, something like 100,000 new skilled jobs in the RMI sector. And that's a sector that we really need to scale up in. It will, of course, begin to tackle energy efficiency, but it will also address fuel poverty. It will also start to address the number of excess deaths due to cold homes in the winter, which stands at about 8 to 10,000 every winter at the moment. And it will also impact fuel poverty and health. So I think the other thing that we need to recognise is the scale of the challenge. So we estimate that we need to spend something like £500 billion over the next 20 years to address this problem. And we have to get our heads around that. I mean, it is an enormous challenge, and it's not one that we're going to address with a few billion here and there in piecemeal interventions. So not all of that, of course, will come from government. We expect about 1/3 of it to come from government, but we need to have that government investment in order to give confidence to the industry so that we can unlock private finance. So it is truly an enormous challenge. How will we go about it? Well, we think that every home should have a building renovation plan that will give homeowners a pathway to decarbonisation through, first of all, fabric efficiency to reduce demand, also through water efficiency and through zero carbon heating. And we think that should be based around a 4-phase plan, kicking off with the government signalling its intent with a long-term policy framework through to 2040 to give a clear line of sight to industry. We then believe that we need to educate homeowners and the industry with a comms plan at scale so that we can really help people to understand the problem that we face and how to go about solving it. And we need to kick-start training and retraining of people in the RMI sector. We then need to launch pilot schemes at the local level to learn the best approaches to take and also to coordinate that at the national level, and then ultimately have a full-scale rollout where we have a mature supply chain and ecosystem, and then with an orderly ramp down as we get towards the end of the programme in the late 30s. And it would be my hope that we find many of these ideas present in the heat and building strategy that we're about to warmly welcome. So the National Retrofit Strategy you can find on the CLC website. There's a lot more detail there about how we should go about delivering the change. But our hope is that government has listened and that we find that in the heat and building strategy. So thank you.
Thank you, David. Last, but by no means least, and who definitely has the toughest job, because he's now going to try and think of something to say after 4 brilliant interventions, is Dr. Taj Oreshin from the UCL Energy Institute. Taj, over to you. Dr. Taj, sorry.
Thanks, Bim. And yes, it's a very hard act to follow everybody's really concise comments. And I'm going to step back a little bit from some of the detailed things that people have mentioned. From my perspective, the good news is that we've actually got many technical ways to achieve zero carbon. And we can use these in a wide range of different ways. We can use heat pumps in people's homes or in district heating systems or as hybrids. Hydrogen can be a store, it can be a vector, or both at different scales. We do, however, need to start to make decisions to avoid duplicating expensive infrastructure if we're going to do this. And for the last 40 years, we've really been discussing this wide range of technologies. We've been researching them, demonstrating them, and some play an important role in almost every scenario that we've developed. Their renewable electricity, their insulation, their heat pumps and thermal stores. It's hard to see a scenario where these do not play some form of important role. What we've now got to do is to really start to deploy these at scale. If this was a moonshot, heat pumps would probably be the lunar lander. They're ready to deploy, can be net zero and reduced by more than 2/3 both space and hot water energy demand, which is the biggest energy demand in the domestic sector. They do have challenges, as all of you are aware, in consumer acceptance. They're bigger, noisier, costlier. Their real-world performance could be radically improved, and they challenge the grid regarding peak generation. However, there's no magic bullet here in any of the technical solutions that are available. Over the last 40 years, we probably accumulated the world's best evidence base of what does and doesn't work. We now need to use this really to deploy the most appropriate systems architecture, including changes to 28 million dwellings. Although the technologies have been around for 40 years, there are really 3 important changes recently, which I believe radically impact what we can now select. The first is net zero rather than 80%, and we've halved the time to deliver the 80%. And this means that in 2050, we cannot burn natural gas in individual homes, and we've got to deploy technologies much, much quicker. The most cost-effective time to deploy technologies is when it's being replaced. And the most important replacement cycle is boilers. Every year, we install 1.6 million boilers a year. That's a lot, but some boilers will only be replaced once between now and 2050. The critical time for fabric improvements is when you buy, refurbish or extend your home, but we normally have under 1 million home sales a year. Every year that we delay the start of rolling out the technologies, we increase the cost and make the interventions far less acceptable. We're just not investing in the scale and urgency at all levels, from deployment research and data right through to deployment skills. The second area which I believe has had a big change in what we're going to do is the fact that wind energy and storage is dramatically reduced in cost. This impacts the cost effectiveness of insulation, for example. The first inch of insulation is the cheapest in a building, the last the most expensive. And due to the law of diminishing returns, it'll be more cost effective to build more wind than have very high levels of insulation in expensive to treat homes. And the third change is related to COVID. COVID will result in a new normal. Domestic energy use will probably change, and it might favour some technologies over others. And it also has the possibility to push more people into fuel poverty, which we've heard discussed. So we have tried or talked about every single type of policy in this area. Investment incentives, pricing, information and advice, standards and regulation. However, as has already been really said, the most important thing in this sector is a clear, sustained vision and strong leadership. This sector has a terrible reputation for penalising early adopters and innovators due to a lack of long-term policy commitment. Trust just has to be rebuilt. We need to utilise key opportunities in a building's life cycle to incentivise change and maintain a diverse ecosystem of organisations to help deliver the refurbishment, an area where there's much innovation. We've now got significant empirical evidence that in this sector, regulations and standards have delivered the major impact. They need to be kept simple and easy to police. Performance-based regulations using smart meters may help with this in the future. Many of the regulations are in place or have been developed, for example, for boiler replacement and consequential improvements. But deployment needs to be done locally, but the regulations, I believe, need to be done nationally. The desire for local regulations has been driven by inaction at a national level. I believe without regulations, it's actually going to cost more to achieve the targets. The other area that we've heard discussed is the importance of pricing of fuels, and the effective subsidy on natural gas and the cost of decarbonisation on electricity are preventing the correct actions at the moment. And it's why at the moment there isn't one EPC out of the many millions that have been done for homes that has recommended a heat pump. Unless that changes, we just will not achieve the targets. How technologies are used has obviously a big effect. So behaviour does matter, but as technology changes, so will behaviour. And policies need to include support for information and advice to influence behaviour, but connected to technical change and not separate from it. So thanks for the opportunity. And my last comment is don't forget cooling, although this is heating we're discussing. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Right, so I'm going to move on to questions now. I've slightly grouped them. I've been thinking about how, try and group the themes of what people are asking about. And so I'm going to embrace my inner faction and ask our unsuspecting members of the panel to ask different questions. So, but other members of the panel, if you've got something to add, do sort of put your hand up or something if you really think somebody maybe has missed something or you want to add something. For the first question is really about fuel poverty, and critically, just to set, and this is as much for me as anybody else, just to set out quite sort of concisely what the key actions are going to need to be in order to A, use this as a moment to end fuel poverty, as one of our speakers mentioned, and secondly, how to protect low-income households for the immense costs of retrofitting, fuel insulation, and various other things. So I'm going to ask first Adam Scorer about this. Adam, could you just answer those 2 points? And if anybody else wants to come in after Adam, just put your hand up and let me know. Adam.
It's an existential question for me. I'll try not to bumble and extend it. There are two critical elements. So if the biggest challenge is the able to pay market, the biggest opportunity that's available is the fuel poor market. Critically, if you're not just after a reduction in bills, you're after thermal comfort and you're after actual well-being. So the energy efficiency of the household, whether you're an owner-occupier, whether you're in the private rented sector, or whether you're in the social housing, is the foundation stone to a sustainable removal, at least reduction, in fuel poverty. And this is for groups of people who will make no contribution to the cost of it, who will receive, who will not be really interested in any transactional kind of metrics of it. You will do it for them. You will do it for them with national funding and through local partnerships. Critical kind of element of it. At the same time, fuel poverty is continually exacerbated, obviously by low income. So the welfare system is hugely important. What suppliers do in terms of debt relief and identifying them is hugely important. But I think, as Taj rightly said, the policy costs that are overlaid on gas bills and electricity bills has to change in order to achieve decarbonisation. The big risk that we have is the opportunity is to use decarbonisation to eradicate fuel poverty through the fabric. You will have to have retail level support to help people who just simply do not have enough money to afford a reasonable level of heat. And you have to avoid the consequence of redistributing policy costs to achieve decarbonisation in a way that unfairly penalises them. The big challenge, Bim, actually, fuel poverty is a big challenge. It's the grey areas between those folk who we identify as being definitively in fuel poverty and therefore are eligible for state support or support directed through obligation schemes from suppliers, and the able to pay market. It's those people, I think we used to call them just about managing, I think was a phrase from a while ago. It's those folk who, like vulnerability, can transition in and out of fuel poverty, and that will be, obviously we think that's a heightened risk with the economic consequences of COVID and the way the economy is going. That's a really challenging area about how you stretch the definition or stretch the applicability of these schemes in order that you catch people who come in and out of fuel poverty on a basis. But fundamentally, long term, it is through the energy efficiency of people's homes and the protection against unreasonable and unfair retail costs and policy costs.
David.
I'd just like to build on that. I mean, I agree with everything that Adam said. But fundamentally, you need to bring down demand. So you need to bring down the amount of energy that's consumed in those homes through improved fabric. But then you need to tackle the conundrum that is COP versus spark gap. So the efficiency of a heat pump, typically seasonally adjusted, is about 260%, or let's say somewhere between 200 and 300. Whereas the cost of electricity is more than 4 times the price of gas. So whilst the heat pump clearly is part of the answer, it's also a problem, because it would, if you did not improve the insulation of the property, you'd actually put up the fuel bills rather than bring them down. So the challenge is either to improve the COP of the heat pump, which of course all industry is working tirelessly on trying to achieve that, and the other is to reduce the cost of the electricity that we generate and the way that we charge that out to the fuel poor. So whether that means that you move the levies, green levies that are placed on electricity, move them off electricity and put them on gas, or whether you fundamentally reduce the cost of generation. But you have to get the performance of the heat pump as a factor that is higher than the incremental cost of electricity over gas.
Great, thank you. Really interesting. Next question, and I say this partly as an interest, as I've got a largely rural constituency and myself, I live outside the village, and it's a question that's come up a couple of times. For people who are in rural, off the gas grid areas, people who use oil and other sort of what you might frankly describe as old-fashioned heating, how in particular do we need the strategy to address those? Because though most people are in that category, there is a significant minority of people who are. So I'm interested in people's views on that. And then secondly, how to do, we spend a lot of time talking about homeowners, right? We're talking about people who own their homes, who have the power to do stuff. For people who are in rented accommodation, and I'm talking about private rented now, we'll deal with social housing separately. For people in private rented accommodation, significant numbers of people, how do we think the strategy needs to deal with those people as well? So the first question on people in very rural off-gas grid areas, and then to people in private rented sector. For the rural question, I'm going to go to Jade to give her view of that, and then on the and then I'll deal with the other one afterwards. So first of all, on the rural off-gas grid areas, how do we help people like my constituents?
Apologies, looking for the unmute button. I think I know where it was by now. People in rural areas face extra challenges. Incomes are lower, prices are higher. So fuel costs can matter more in those areas. And, we look at maybe hydrogen, but how well is that going to work in rural areas? So, the government's clean growth strategy did commit to phase out the use of high carbon fossil fuels off gas grid in 2020. And therefore, boilers must be replaced with low carbon alternatives. And there isn't one size fits all, as it was said earlier. There isn't a silver bullet. But it does seem likely that things like biomass and heat pumps will form the majority of those. So as I said earlier, that we need to make sure that there's funding for local authorities to deal at a local level with areas of their fuel poverty. So we need to make sure that the funding's available to install measures and retrofit those properties. As we said, we need to do that for the long term so that it does address fuel poverty and take a more holistic approach, so that we are actually addressing fuel poverty and providing warmer, comfortable, healthier homes as well. And what wasn't said earlier actually is that, the cost of doing this pays for itself. I know the BRE has done lots of research in the past on the cost of poor homes to the economy, and this is billions of pounds every year. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but we always focus on the cost of doing things for zero carbon as being high. And we know there's no easy solution to this. We know we need to take a whole house approach. Heat pumps need the insulation. If you're doing that, the insulation to high levels, you need to consider air quality and you need to look at air tightness. So a whole house approach is the right approach. It is a bit more costly, but the cost of not doing this is huge. People lose their lives because of poor quality homes anyway, and the cost pays for itself in terms of payback to the economy from jobs, reduced NHS spends and the likes. So we need to make sure that the funding is there to address people in fuel poor areas, in rural areas in particular, and make sure that that's getting through to the local authorities to be able to help them to do that.
Perfect. I'm going to bring in Duncan Carter from Calor Gas, who has some wisdom on this. Duncan.
Great, thanks, Bim. Yeah, no, we're the UK's largest supplier of low carbon gas to rural communities in Britain, and we think we've got an option to the choices that another option to the choices that Jade mentioned to complement heat pumps' role and biomass role within rural areas. I think the key challenge in off-grid areas is the retrofit challenge, because you have very low levels of energy efficiency. You've only got 3% of homes at EPC band C or better. So getting those homes up to the level of energy efficiency where a heat pump will be a cost-effective solution is going to be prohibitively expensive for many. And we think government is currently underestimating the proportion there. I think from a technical perspective, Bayes research suggests 90% could be suitable for heat pump, but when you start factoring in cost and the levels of disruption that consumers are prepared to pay or can afford to pay and are prepared to tolerate, we think the number is going to be nearer to sort of 50 or 60% of homes that are suitable for immediate electrification, leaving a big gap for homes which biomass won't be suitable because it potentially has air quality issues, requires manual handling. So we think, for those hard to treat homes, a green gas provides an effective solution. And that's where we think we've got a role to play in this decarbonisation. It's really important because rural are going first. So, that's the government ambition, but actually we're starting with the hardest homes to treat. Actually, a much better policy would just be to go all the easy stuff, i.e. the homes which have got low heat demand, let's just go heat pumps for those, whether they're on or off gas grid. And actually this dichotomy between on and off gas grid is very unhelpful. We should just get crack on with the heat pumps on the easy stuff and actually start bringing in more solutions to tackle the really difficult stuff, which is the old drafty detached homes that are predominant in rural areas.
Thank you. For my second point question that came through on the Q&A about how we help people in private rented accommodation, or rather, if I reframe it, how we ensure that those buildings are made as efficient as possible. I'm going to ask Dr. Taj Orashi, could you come in on this point? Because I think that, frankly, this is more of a challenge than when you're dealing with homeowners in their own homes.
Yeah, I mean, this is without doubt a real challenge, and it's hard to see how without regulation moving the private rented sector, this will actually occur. And it is, I mean, to some extent, we've already been discussing some of the difficulties in the cost-effective argument here. And depending on who you're talking about, it being cost effective too. And obviously for landlords, it's not quite the same as for occupants, and it isn't the same for the nation. I mean, it's in some ways a little bit ironic that the UK is probably the world's lead in understanding and valuing the co-benefits of energy efficiency. And we've discussed health and issues like that. We now have phenomenally good health economic models which can model the cost benefit of energy efficiency in terms of its impact on refurbishment. And obviously the rented sector is one which is key to that understanding. So I'm not a policy person, so I can't figure out how to develop the best policies for that. But I think in terms of the evidence base, in terms of the overall cost benefits, you know, for many parts of that sector, the health costs far outweigh the cost savings in terms of direct fuel costs for some sectors, particularly those obviously that are in fuel poverty.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Gillian Charlesworth on a different question now, which came through in the Q&A about, oh right, there's a quiz, a poll. So if it pops up on your screen, do answer the poll as best you can. I'm going to turn to Gillian to ask her about EPCs. So first of all, how good and effective do you think they are? I know it came up with it's already come up already, but how it can be improved, what you'd like to see in the EPC, and what you think the chances are of us actually persuading the government as a whole to do that. But maybe almost frankly, maybe I should answer the last bit once I've heard your first bit. So, Gillian, what's your sense on EPCs?
Well, I'm afraid to say that I think EPCs are very limited in their usefulness. I've been working in this industry for 17 years, which is not as long as some others here. And EPCs were seen as a really important move in the mid-noughties. But I think, you know, we really have to move on from what is a very, very limited measure. Somebody mentioned earlier that they just don't, I think it was Taj was talking about not one single one has recommended a heat pump. Well, we've spent the morning talking about the need to introduce heat pumps at scale. So I think that kind of summarises the limitations. We're responding at the moment to the commercial side of this equation, where there is a feeling, I think, there also that EPCs for commercial buildings might also tick the box. I think we would say they don't. We need much more holistic view of it. We need to cover many more aspects of sustainability, and I think this debate has shown that it can be funded from the savings that will be made if we take a much more ambitious and bold approach. So we would want to see requirements which go well beyond having to produce an EPC, and making sure that whatever requirements are set out by the assessment that is carried out actually are seen through. That's the twin pillar here. We can get data, and there's lots of ways of getting data. BRE provides a lot of data on where the unhealthiest homes are. But if we're not acting on it holistically, as has been discussed this morning, then I think there's a very limited, we're just not going to make the progress as I think we've concluded here this morning.
Thank you. something's just come through on the chat that dovetails with another question that I want to ask to David Pindo. It's about homes, seeing as it's his day job. The first point is people in flats. You know, he talks a lot about houses. How does it work for flats? What are the most effective energy, low carbon energy solutions, heating solutions, should I say, for those sorts of buildings? And the second point is there is, as Matthew Carter has put in, a bit of a lack of confidence in private sector installers. He was referring to heat pumps in particular situation with that. So I'm interested in, David, your view of those twin challenges, because I do think that they are, you know, going to undermine delivering whatever strategy is set out. So what's your sense of it?
Okay, well, taking the second part first, I think installers only really sell the products that they're confident in installing, repairing and maintaining. So there's clearly a training issue. And part of that will fall on manufacturers. But in all honesty, the size of the challenge is just frankly enormous. And it has to go back to further education. And we need college courses for people to be able to tackle the installation of heat pumps, or heating systems more broadly, because we've got 130,000 gas safe heating engineers dealing with gas installation and service and maintenance, to install 1.6 million boilers a year. We're only currently installing 30,000 heat pumps. So if we're to deliver the government's targets for heat pumps of 600,000 by 2028 or more than 1 million by 2030, who's going to do the work? And the common conclusion seems to be that somehow these gas safe engineers are going to transfer across and do the work on heat pumps. But if you look at the demographic on heat pump engineers, most of them, I think the median is in the 50s. And I think most will just see out the final wave of installs of gas boilers and retire. So we need a whole generation of heat pump engineers. And bear in mind, it takes much longer to install a heat pump than it does a boiler. So, I mean, I don't know if anyone's modeled the numbers, and we need some evidence there, but it wouldn't surprise me if we need something of the order of 200,000 plus heat pump engineers. And don't forget, when you put a heat pump in, it's not just a heat pump, it's a whole new heating system. A combi boiler doesn't have a cylinder. A combi boiler works with small radiators and or other emitters, whereas a heat pump works best with underfloor heating, needs a cylinder. You need plumbers with level 3 experience, you need electricians, you need heat pump installers, and you need someone to decommission the boiler. So you need a whole army of people to effect a heat pump installation, and they all need to be confident in what they're doing. I mean, my experience is that the installer is the retailer, and so in effect, they're the ones who are selling the solution to the end user. So we need to, of course, educate the end user, but the most important thing is to educate and train a sufficient body of skilled installers to not only install, but also sell the products, because they're the people that actually do the selling door to door. On the first question on flats, apartments, multi-occupancy, I think the answer probably lies in heat networks and having heat interface units in the individual dwellings, but a central large-scale heat engine, whether that's a heat pump or a combination of heat pumps and boilers. I think the short answer is heat networks with heat interface units in the home.
Great. That's all we've got time for. I've just learned so much from this event. I just cannot thank all the panelists enough. There's been such an engaged chat and Q&A. I've tried to get to as many of the points as I could. What we'll be doing is sending our panelists the full list of the things in the chat and Q&A so that they can respond after this, because I just think this was such an engaging event by you. So I just want to say thank you so much for all of you for listening and participating and contributing so wisely and interestingly, and particularly to our panelists as well, because I just think it's such an important issue that you have educated us all on. So I just want to say thank you very, very much. There will be more events like this coming near you on all sorts of other subjects. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Bye-bye. Bye.